The Gators Breakdown podcast is ready to go. I'm your host, David Waters, and you can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. And I probably should preface that in boldface, bold font, everything at GatorDave_SEC because there is a fake account out there pretending to be me spreading some pretty false accusations of what our topic tonight. But don't follow that. Make sure the Twitter handle is at GatorDave_SEC. But joining me tonight is Will Salmon from The Athletic. He joins me here on this episode of Gators Breakdown. And Will, I wish we were talking under different circumstances, but instead, we have to discuss the decision to transfer from Chris Steele. And thanks for joining me on short notice.
Oh, of course. Like you mentioned, it's quite the topic here in Gainesville. Big news that we kind of got wind about late last night, Wednesday night, and that trickled into the morning. And shortly before noon Eastern, Chris Steele was in the transfer portal with the intention, as far as we know, to leave Florida.
Yeah, like you said, I got a hold of you Wednesday night, and we tried to figure out what was right and what was wrong. There were so many rumors out there that, and that's kind of why it took some time, and we wanted to make sure that we had everything right, and and there were some, connections, and then we'll get into the Gainesville Sun and what they reported, because Zach Aberverde is, kind of very close. He edited the Chris Steele commitment video. We're really kind of close to that situation from that perspective. So of course, some people want to say it's slanted that way, but Zach does a good job at what he does. But before we get there, guys, remember you can find Gators Breakdown at newsforjacks.com/Gators Breakdown. You'll find all the past episodes there. Also, catch the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, YouTube, and Spotify. I'm using those services. Please share, rate, and review the shows. So, Will, kind of what we'll concentrate on here is maybe kind of the fallout of Chris Steele's decision to enter the transfer portal there. Of course, the last week in Florida football has been one to forget. Jalen Jones and his decision to transfer from the University of Florida, and the connection that goes along with this story. DeMarcus Bowman choosing Clemson over Florida late last week as well. And Brian Edwards getting arrested for just reasons that he didn't need to be. This stuff needs to stop there. So the sexual battery there that Brian Edwards was arrested for. And now this decision by Chris Steele. And like you said, late Wednesday night, we were getting word of this and what was going on. And kind of starts with he asked to be moved from the dorm room with former Florida quarterback Jalen Jones. There's some things that were going on that Chris Steele didn't necessarily feel comfortable with, according to this. That's what I have heard, and kind of confirming in the report from the Gainesville Sun that he wished to be removed from the dorm room with Jalen Jones. And we kind of don't know what happened after that. We know they both played in the spring game, though, around that time. Jalen Jones, and then the report last week of the dropped allegation, or there was allegation that some sexual misconduct with two females. Those have been dropped, and there's kind of where the connection goes, and going from Steele to Jalen Jones. So the part of it was during the first month of campus, Steele had made his intentions pretty known to the staff that he didn't necessarily like being around Jalen Jones, wasn't comfortable rooming with him, and kind of just maybe spiraled from there, Will.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's important to note a couple of key questions remain unanswered in the whole situation. And I think sort of chief among them includes the situation particularly and specifically about Jalen Jones, because I think a key question that has been unanswered is, when did the staff, and especially Dan Mullen, know that Jalen Jones had these issues? Because the allegations and the report was made before he played in the spring game. So I know people will say, okay, that's just a practice game or whatever, but he was still representing Florida, still a big time event for the university. So he was still a representative of the school in that way. And so how much was the staff aware even to that point? Because if you go back and look, there wasn't anything out there, publicly at least, about Jalen Jones' situation. So who knows? I think that that information is critical in sort of assessing the validity of some of the reports out there, including what Chris Steele said or didn't say to whichever member on staff that he made those concerns, that he brought about those concerns to. Who did he bring those concerns to is a question in and of itself. Was it Dan Mullen? Was it a staffer? How seriously were they taken? What was the chain of command in perhaps getting that request to move from where he was living with Jalen Jones to somewhere else? Where was that request on the command to Dan Mullen if it wasn't Dan Mullen himself who was the first one to sort of hear those words from Chris Steele? So a lot of questions remain to be answered. I'm not sure if we will get those answers in the coming days, but hopefully we do. Hopefully there is some light to that, because I think that before anybody sort of makes some blanket statements on how things were handled, I think some additional context is necessary from all sides, to be quite frank, because I think it's a combination of a lot of things, or at least a couple of things, and not necessarily just one thing. I think the fact that Chris Steele was actually named in the report that became public is probably something that, if I'm part of Chris Steele's family, that's rubbing me the wrong way, because he had no wrongdoings according to the report, and he was just a witness in it. But a lot of people on social media have and already did make some incorrect judgments and made some leaps and conclusions based on just his name appearing alone in that report. So I can totally understand that peeving Chris Steele and his family members if that was the case. I totally would understand that. So I feel like a couple of those things could lead to that combination where you just feel like you're not being taken too seriously, or as seriously as you should be.
Yeah, I don't know when we'll get clarity on this and how much clarity we'll get. The questions you raised are valid, and it's the part was, Chris Steele, when he basically wanted to move, there was no plan to move Steele until the summer, according to the sources Zach Aberverdi put in a Gainesville.com article, and that did upset Steele and his parents there, and I can understand that. He's at college all the way across country, and you were kind of trusting these coaches to be the figures there to kind of take care of your son far away. And if those questions were if those concerns from Steele were kind of given to the staff, and from after that point, nothing was done. And then, of course, a couple weeks later, the Jalen Jones stuff happens, and maybe that was their worry. Maybe that was the fear. Maybe that was what Chris Steele tried to get away from. And as you said, it's mentioned in the report. And of course, there's going to be some guilty by association there that probably isn't fair there. So yeah, that might be. I know we're saying might. There's a lot of assumptions and not a lot of facts out there, but kind of maybe that's part of the fallout of this is not a lot of clarity in this situation. But it does look like, and from talking from people I know too, that the concerns were raised. But as you said, Will, we don't know how serious they were taken. Should they have been taken more serious? In hindsight, it definitely looks that way. With given what has happened, but maybe there's blame to go all the way around. Don't really know that part yet.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you can make sort of like a statement saying that this is an example of a lack of information sort of affecting a lot of people's characters in a lot of different ways. Particularly with even Dan Mullen, I kind of find it a little bit hard to believe that, okay, this is your top rated recruit, David, and he's supposedly telling members of your staff, if not you yourself, that, hey, I am uncomfortable living where I am living, and I have a desire and a wish to be removed from this place and in a safer location for myself. I have a very hard time believing that a head coach of an SEC program hears that from his top recruit, the highest rated player on his team, even, and doesn't do anything about it. So I don't know. I'm very eager and interested to learn Dan Mullen's side of the situation, or at least his perspective. I hate to say side because I don't want to say they're against each other or anything like that,
Yeah.
but I would appreciate his perspective. I don't know if we're ever going to quite get it, but that's just worth mentioning just because I don't know. I just, that part to me, that's where I kind of get a little bit hung up on, because here you have, obviously it's a dire situation where clearly Dan Mullen did not want to lose him. So why wouldn't there be an action? Why wouldn't he be taken seriously? That to me is interesting. I mean, obviously, I'm not trying to say they're above, anybody on the staff is above making a mistake or anything like that. Mistakes happen, and
Yeah. And mistakes happen to
certain,
good, and mistakes happen to good people as well.
yeah.
Yeah.
And but I just, a mistake of that magnitude for
Yeah.
me, considering all the factors, I don't know. It's just hard. It's hard to wrap your head around how that could happen.
Yeah, I agree. And some people were, on social media were saying, it just doesn't happen on a whim. It's in the middle of a semester. You can't just go to another dorm. I'm kind of in that thought as well. I mean, come on, we know what happens around football programs. If your top signee wants to get out of a dorm room, I'm sure there's a way.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's a way to figure that out. But another aspect of this is maybe it kind of was too little too late with him and his family, with the aspect of Jalen Jones has already made his intentions known that he's not going to be at the University of Florida, and he's not going to be around. So if you didn't want to be around Jalen Jones, well, he's not going to be at the University of Florida. So why in the last couple of days has it now come out that you also don't want to be part of the University of Florida, when it looked like the issue that you had is now no longer on campus? So what I'm thinking was, kind of just an assumption here, it maybe the damage was done and there was no way to fix it, especially coming from the parent side, and being that far away. I keep going back to that, being all the way across country, and once one thing happens, maybe it kind of just sets the light bulb off, and you kind of have to kind of start taking care of your own at that point.
Definitely. And it's worth pointing out also that Chris Steele himself quote tweeted Zach's report.
Yeah.
And so that would lead you to think that he is standing by what is included in that report. Also, Chris Steele's father went to Twitter and made a tweet regarding the fact that somebody's last name is pretty valuable. And once that gets brought up and mentioned in certain contexts that are unfavorable for that person, things get remembered. And that's unfortunate. And that becomes part of your story long after, years after it happens. It stays with you, that type of stuff. And it's unfortunate. Those are two things that I think are worth pointing out, because in spite of the fact that people like me have been unsuccessful with getting a Chris Steele and or his father to go on the record and talk a little bit about the issues, they are dropping some hints here and there on social media and publicly, that would lead you to sort of put things together as far as what their perspective includes.
Yeah, definitely agree with that point as well. And I think part of the fallout, looking at this as well, fair or unfair, is going to be, at least on the surface, a bad look on the staff from around the nation, that this is the way the story is going to be proposed. And there's going to be some negative recruiting that's going on around the SEC, around the country. Different opposing coaches are going to spin this, and so why would you want to go to Florida when things like this are happening? And that's probably the biggest fallout of this right now, until everything gets sorted out, till everything gets cleared, is, to me, recruiting just become a little bit harder for this coaching staff. And maybe I'm not on field coaching so much, but maybe the support staff, there probably needs to be a fix there. We know some behind the scenes moves are happening. Kewan Ratliff just got hired, and with Otis Yelverton and everything that happened around that. So there's kind of some already issues, kind of a little bit of issues are already there. But now I think this, at least going out on the recruiting trail, this is going to be a hot topic. There's going to be a lot of questions asked. You got parents of as you just mentioned, going out on Twitter and putting stuff out there that other parents are going to see and have to maybe even think about now when they are looking at the University of Florida.
Definitely, and we live in an age where information comes out slowly, but it's the information that tends to come out the quickest is what's almost taken as truth, no matter what, unfortunately. And so I think also the fact that the report that came out, the immediacy of it matters because I was talking to a Florida signee just today around kind of the same time, and he had brought up, oh hey, the coaching staff. Maybe they should have acted sooner based on what I just read. And it's like kind of funny because he was citing something that happened just on his Twitter feed. And then obviously he made some calls and got more filled in as the day went on, as did I. But that's what a lot of people go off of. And that's how that works. And that's how a part of the reason why negative recruiting is so successful, because you could take something and make it larger than what it is. I'm not trying to make anything light of what happened or didn't happen here at Florida, but just broadly speaking, that's what happens. And it's not like Florida didn't have other examples where you could negatively recruit. I mean, they just had a kid from Lakeland, Florida, go to Clemson. And so a potential recruiter from any other SEC school or Florida State for that matter can point to that and say, hey, they can't even get a kid from their pipeline school to commit to them, and they lose him to Clemson. And those are also things that get brought up in those conversations with kids. Fair or unfair, like you said, David, those things do exist. So for a staff that has been criticized about the lack of an ability to reel in high profile kids, this doesn't make anything easier. And that talent gap between Florida and the SEC elites, such as Georgia and Alabama, only widens, of course. And when you're not recruiting at a high level, you can't afford for that to widen like that.
Yeah, and part of this is that I don't want to make it sound like it's all on the player side or Chris Steele's side, but with the article that was released, that's one angle of it, and that's been out there. And like we said, we haven't necessarily heard, we haven't heard from the coaching staff and what they think about this. So, I mean, it's we can't think for the coaches. We can't put out there for the coaches. There's a thought out there that maybe Steele was homesick. Maybe he just didn't want to be around the University of Florida. It's hard at this moment, and in what we're looking at in this whole story to find the other side from the coach's angle and not necessarily make it look like they're the bad guys here.
Yeah, just like the old adage. I mean, it's probably a little bit of this, a little bit of that.
Yeah,
It may even be a bigger issue than all that we even know. For all we know, those are all possibilities. And like you mentioned, we can only sort of go by what is presently out there or what has been reported, or what we ourselves have heard and can pass along. But yeah, I mean, there's at the end of the day, there's still no two ways about the fact of how devastating of a loss this is for Florida's program. That much is undeniable, regardless of how it happened. The end result of the closest on a team devoid of 5 stars, for the closest thing you have to a 5-star to leave the program, not even before he ever even plays in a game. I mean, that just underscores the talent disparity between UF and the other powers. And we're also talking about a Florida program that has lost a big time signee now 3 straight cycles in a row. Now the Robinson deal was a separate issue altogether, but you also have Watkins from last year. And it's funny because you mentioned how much of an abysmal week or period this has been for Florida. Last year they had that period as well where, we had frying pans and guns and Justin Watkins, and things got really hairy during that time period. So I guess all that to say that these things do happen, but the recency bias suggests that this is it's easy to lump it all together and say, okay, this is getting really bad, because taken one by one, these things are all pretty bad.
Yeah, and also coming from the fan side of me, of course, everybody knows this podcast. I'm a Gator fan first. I still fully support Dan Mullen and what it goes right now and what he's doing for the program. I don't want to necessarily make it look like there's no support for the head coach of the University of Florida. This is just it might just be one mistake, or it may not be one mistake. We'll see when we hear from the coach himself, and that's kind of where it plays out. But I still believe he's the right guy for the job. He's going to get it done his way. I don't necessarily think is a mistake in bringing these certain players on the roster, and we'll kind of see with the rest of the class when they get on board here. But I still believe Dan Mullen cares about his players. I don't think this is the kind of blanket excuse out there that he's lying to his players just to get them on campus or overlooking some things to bring these guys in. It honestly right now just to me it's just an unfortunate situation.
Yeah, I think part of it is a little bit unfair when you say, when you take a lot of things and you add them up together and try to make something out of things that may not necessarily connect and fit together as a particular puzzle. Now, don't get me wrong. Obviously, all of it falls under the umbrella of Florida football, which is ultimately in the hands of Dan Mullen. But to take, for example, Bryce Langston's decommitment shortly after Chris Steele's announced, entering the transfer portal. Now, those two things, certainly not all of this happens like separately, but those two things now, are those two things related, or is that just coincidental, sort of like a when it rains it pours situation for Florida? I would lean toward the latter in that situation. Now you can say to yourself, okay, well, you had the Jalen Jones situation, and Brian Edwards' arrest was somewhat similar, where it involves some ugly allegations regarding the mistreatment of a woman. So those two things are similar, but again, it's two separate people. It is two separate people making mistakes. So it's hard. It really is hard to kind of lump that all together and say, okay, this is a dumpster fire now, because all these things are happening at once. And that's why I mentioned what happened last year, because all of that sort of trickled out around the same time, around like a 2 or 3 week period where things did get very strange in a hurry. And there were a lot of questions about what Dan Mullen's level of sort of discipline was or will be at Florida, and all those were fair questions, as they are still now. And all that to say that it is a fair question on the character of kids that are brought into the program, because maybe there was a reason why certain schools were not after them, and maybe that made them a little bit accessible to the Gators, and that is a valid point. But I will say though that a lot of that is I don't a lot of that has not been factual, where we don't know for sure what the hangups are with some of the kids that people are spewing out there on social media as potential rumors. So again, it's another one of those situations where we're going to have to ride it out and see, and then assess, okay, this is how recruiting has been these last two cycles under Dan Mullen, and what can we make of this, and where are we at right now?
And another thing, Will, it is off the field, not really nothing to do with recruiting and all that stuff, but it is coming, 2 years after a big credit card scandal that University of Florida had under the previous regime and Jim McElwain. And after such a good, we had the Tay-Bang incident last year under Dan Mullen, but there wasn't a lot of off-field issues there. You had CeCe Jefferson miss some games toward the beginning of the season. That kind of caught some people's eye, and Brad Stewart throughout the season, but there wasn't a lot of off-field issues there. And a lot of fans were thinking, okay, we're turning the corner here. And then in the last week or so, you have all these off-the-field issues, and it's like, oh no, is it here we go again?
Yeah, it's funny because I had a commenter on one of my stories at The Athletic ask me, "Wow, what's going on lately? Is there somebody working behind the scenes with the Florida players, because nobody's getting in trouble and everything looks so great as far as discipline goes, and we don't seem to have the issues that have plagued us in the past, or the embarrassing off the field fiascos?" And my response is pretty much what my response is now, that that's not exactly something where you can kind of point to and be like, okay, Dan Mullen has really changed everything around and everything's in tip-top order. The same way you're not necessarily able to point the finger at him now and look at it as an indictment on his leadership. I think a lot of it is a little bit cyclical, where this type of stuff happens at college programs. Especially when you're trying to attract talent at a high level, at sometimes despite some off the field character flaws or potential risks. And you see that a lot throughout the country at top flight programs.
One more thing about this, Will, and it's being brought up again because of Chris Steele, and I have mentioned numerous times his family being in California and him all the way across country. And hey, look on a lot of Gators Breakdown episodes and the Gator panels that we did, and a lot the topic of California recruiting was big at this time a year ago. When you have all this talent in the state of Florida, why are you going out there to the state of California to get talent? And then for a while, after Steele committed to USC, it was like, what are we doing wasting so much time out there? Well, USC has a bad season. Florida's kind of was already in good shape. He had decommitted from UCLA previously, now decommits to USC. And he comes to Florida all the way from California. The staff spent so much time out there, spent so many resources out there. Didn't look like it was going to pay off, and you get Steele to finally commit to the Gators. And there were some rumors right before he committed to Florida that maybe South Carolina was more in it as well. I don't know whether to buy that so much or not, but it does beg the question. And I saw this out there a lot of social media too. Does this need to be the end of recruiting California? And no, that's taking it to the extreme. I was not big on that plan at this time last year, but it was a new staff. They were using connections of the staff members that they had who had connections to the state of California. They thought they had a leg in there and could get some of these guys to come over. Yes, Steele was the only one who ended up there, but now with what happened and maybe distance playing a factor in somewhat, once one thing happens, you're not with your parents, something goes wrong, and now it kind of, like I said, maybe sets the lights off in the parents that, hey, you need to be closer to home when things happen like this. It does beg the question now, how much resources, how much effort do you put into to recruiting the state of California when the state of Florida is loaded and kind of you need to be concentrating to your home kids?
Definitely a valid question, and I think that it's also worth mentioning that chances are, at most, you're probably only getting one kid from California in a cycle. Now, you see programs like Ohio State, Texas, whoever, they're gonna get a kid from California. Your elite teams will do that, particularly Southern California, and Florida should be in that mix where they're able to go to a South California and get a kid. But that's to say, like, okay, you get one kid. So if he doesn't pan out, it looks the way it looks now, where people are questioning, is this even worth it for this one guy who is no longer here? And to that, I would have to say, probably still yes to some degree. Now, I wouldn't advocate for spending resources and time over a kid in Florida or over a kid that's closer to your footprint. But if you're going out there, as Dan Mullen put it to me once, for a day, I don't necessarily see the harm in that. It's not like Dan Mullen spent a week out there
Yeah.
just for one kid. He went there for a day on some occasions, came right back. It's not like he's spending a vacation time there and just on the side or something like that. So it depends on how much time. Now, with that though, comes the level of, okay, well, if you're only spending X amount of time there, how well do you even know the kid that you're bringing in? And so that's another question of itself. But you also look at the flip side and say, okay, well, Dan Mullen also knew Jalen Jones for a handful of years.
There you go.
Now we see how that turned out.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's just not black and white as many people love things to be. It's just never going to be that way, especially when it comes to recruiting.
Yeah, I do find it hard to fault coaches when things like this with 17-year-olds go wrong. You can't see this coming. If you saw this coming, well, you probably wouldn't have brought him on campus in the first place. A head coach doesn't want to deal with this right now. They don't want to deal with these things. They want to be able to sign these players, and they want these players to play. Are they taking some chances? Yes, but every program out there is taking chances on kids. Did Florida get desperate? Maybe so because they needed to kind of turn the tides. I don't know. I can't answer that. Maybe it looks that way at some points, as we kind of got into earlier. But you can't tell me that if a kid's gonna go in here and act like a choir boy, or if he's gonna go and be a college kid. These are kids first and foremost. Things are gonna happen. We've seen it throughout Florida. Does it seem to happen more at Florida? Maybe. I don't know. This podcast has a moniker. There's never a dull moment in Gator Nation, and part of that plays into it. But you can't sit here and tell me, oh, we shouldn't have brought this kid in because of what happened. To me, it just doesn't work that way.
No, I mean, clearly there have been some depressing sort of if you're a Florida fan, results from the California recruiting, even going back to Powell from way back when,
Mm-hmm.
as your, I guess, all-time best recruit, and him having sort of that career where he doesn't live up to the hype. So you look back on it and say, okay, it hasn't been fruitful for you, but still, you ended up with a close to a consensus top 50 kid playing at a position that you desperately needed to fill with an elite amount of talent, and you accomplished that by expanding your brand also. So I don't know. It's to me, I don't look at it. It's just too easy to look at it in hindsight and say, yeah, that shouldn't have happened. It's just because at the time it made complete sense, and I'm telling you, you sign up for that today, um, because there's no guarantee that that kid pans out less than the kid from South Florida does. Now you could argue the fact that, yeah, his parents are at a disadvantage and he's away from his family. Flip side is, for a lot of kids, they're better off that way,
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately. So again, I mean, you take everybody's certain specific situation and you evaluate it from there, and you resist the urge to sort of make blanket statements, and I think you're in a better position to sort of assess what's going right and what's going wrong.
Yeah, and I did send out a tweet today that kind of retweeting Zach's article about what was going on with this, and yeah, maybe it was taken that I was throwing shade at the staff, and it was more as of, if Steele did go for help and the staff didn't know, it did nothing about it, then if he didn't feel comfortable, then maybe they should have helped him, but that's the part of if that happened. So still, as we go back to it, still not a lot of clarity out there. Hopefully, this gets resolved pretty fast. I think Dan Mullen has some Gator gathering stops next week. That might be the first time. I don't know if there'll be a press conference or a press release released in the next couple of days or so. If it's a press conference, probably have to be tomorrow on a Friday. If not, maybe, like I said, some kind of press release. But it may just be next week until we hear, Will, because once local media gather at these Gator gatherings, these questions will be brought up.
Definitely, and Florida fans are pretty savvy enough to ask them in their own.
Yeah, yeah, true. Yeah, in that situation, yeah, they get the chance too.
Q&A sessions are better than the press conferences. So yeah, no question. I wouldn't. I honestly, I was told that there was not going to be a statement when it happened on Thursday, so that would lead me to believe that I'm not expecting much on a Friday either, for that matter. Haven't been told that, but no reason to expect it. So yeah, I mean, the next time Dan Mullen may speak publicly may end up being next week on one of his speaking tours. The first one, I believe, is Wednesday in Tampa. So that, off the top of my head, seems to be the next time he would speak publicly.
All right. Well, so before I let you go, let's kind of we'll do a U-turn and kind of get something. Yesterday, Florida released and Colorado. Florida and Colorado released that they're going to play each other 2028, 2029. I did a quick little video and gave my thoughts yesterday, but you being around Scott Strickland and Dan Mullen for quite some time at Mississippi State, and I know fans kind of set themselves up for disappointment a little bit with this, and myself included. We were thinking, hey, look, the Texas game is probably coming. I think we know that one is along the lines. But when it kind of got around that this probably would be a Pac-12 school, of course, all the targeting went to USC or UCLA or maybe Oregon, maybe Washington, and Colorado was kind of a letdown for a lot of fans. So, what's your thoughts on the Colorado matchup and what fans not necessarily can expect in a decade or so when these two teams get together, but maybe just the kind of overall look of Florida playing Colorado?
Hey, it's an improvement. I mean,
Yeah.
let's start there. Secondly, I was actually in Los Angeles on vacation for a few days. I just got back like yesterday. And so, yeah, I would have gladly signed up 10 years in advance, booked my flight back to USC and for a home and home action. That would have been quite cool. So, yeah, I'm with the fans on that one. But hey, look, it's still an upgrade. Yes, Florida plays Florida State every year. And from a scheduling perspective, that can complicate the issue of, okay, how hard were we making this schedule when you're projecting the fact that Florida State's going to be relatively strong. It at least was the thinking, and will continue to be. You have USF on the horizon as well. So in a lot of ways, you look at it and you say to yourself, okay, like there isn't that much of a need to go outside the state. I mean, you could have scheduled UCF. You don't know where UCF is going to be in 10 years. But right now, it looks like that their success is something that they can kind of continue for at least a couple of years, and then we'll see where things are at with that program. But there's a lot of reason if you schedule in Miami, if you're going to have Florida State every year, USF is on the horizon. UCF may be a possibility. Who knows? I mean, I don't necessarily blame Florida for not leaving the state like that, but it is pretty huge, I will say, the fact that they are, just from a college football fan standpoint, because that hadn't happened since 1991 for a true out of conference away game. So out of the state.
Yeah.
That doesn't include Florida State. So I wanted to make sure I got all of those variables correct. But that hadn't happened. The Michigan game, of course, was a neutral site, so that hadn't happened since 1991 when they went to Syracuse, and some really interesting things happened in that loss for the Gators.
Well, before I let you go, can't believe I didn't bring this up when we were discussing Chris Steele. Hey, we kind of got away from one part about it on the field. He took part in spring. Of course, looked to be that probably number 3 cornerback when you talk the outside cornerback spots between C.J. Henderson, Marco Wilson. Probably one of the lead backups there as well. Now that kind of goes away, and you'll be waiting for Jadon Hill to get healthy. Kyrie Elam to come in for summer, and Chester Kimbrough as well. Not necessarily. Look, we expected him to play a good bit this year anyway. He took part in spring, really asserted himself as a pretty good player. Needed to grow some, as we saw, but made a good play in the end zone in the spring game to break up a touchdown pass. Hey, look, he was going to get some playing time, but now, this is not necessarily an issue for the 2019 season, but what you were looking at for 2020 was Elam and Steele kind of taking over those 2 outside corner spots with the likelihood that Henderson and Wilson are going to take their talents to the NFL.
Yeah, 100%. The way I would say it was this changes the outlook for Florida a little bit, because you are in a very what's the word? Just a situation where you're vulnerable to what happened to you last year, where you had a Marco Wilson suffer an injury, and then you don't have the depth, and you're forced to play guys some extended snaps that they're not necessarily talented enough to carry for the long haul over the course of a season. And that's how Georgia was able to expose you and frankly beat you, was to take advantage of that weakness consistently, pretty much every drive for a little while. And so you're again susceptible to that, because you are going to be leaning heavily on an Elam who didn't enroll early, and will enroll soon, and make it to camp. But you are relying on him to be probably a key backup for you because of his just natural ability and talent. But that's not the situation that you wanted to be in, because you had Chris Steele, and he had the ability to kind of step in, play meaningful snaps, and make you take sort of a sigh of relief or a breath when you had a Marco Wilson out there, or a C.J. Henderson, who probably played a lot more snaps than he should have too, because that wasn't ideal for C.J. Henderson to be on the field all those snaps that he played last year. Ideally, you want that guy to take a little bit of a break. I mean, he's your best defensive player. You can't have him I mean, I'm not trying to say that he doesn't have the energy. He clearly does, but you can't have him out there the amount of time that he was out there. I mean, the game is just too fast nowadays for that. It's too physical. That's going to come back to bite you one way or the other. The guy's not Superman as much as sometimes he looks like he is. So, yeah, I mean, they're not. It's not a crushing loss for this year on the field, but it's certainly huge next year, because, like you said, David, they were relying on Chris Steele to be a starter. Even if Wilson came back, it probably would have been Wilson and Steele.
Oh, yeah, Will. Never a dull moment, man. Was it? I guess you've covered the team and the staff. Was it like this at Mississippi State too?
Not really, actually. It wasn't. No, not really. I mean, you're not really dealing with like not take anything away from their recruiting abilities or whatnot, but you're not dealing with the same level of talent. And frankly, you're just not dealing with the level of stakes that a Florida is playing with. I mean, they entered this year probably going to be a preseason top 10, and they already had an offensive line that had issues. Now, like I said, you're again in a vulnerable position. Now it's not as bad as it was last year because Wilson's healthy, but man, it's just not good. And that's just on the field. We talked about off the field for quite a while that outlined all those issues. But yeah, I mean, it's just not a good look these days.
Yep, and just to add insult to injury, Georgia just got another 5-star linebacker in Mikael Sherman. So, ouch.
Talk about a team that can afford to lose a 5-star.
Yeah. Oh well, we'll get there. We'll get them. We'll get them one day. We'll get them one day. All right. Well, hey man, thanks. Like I said, short notice. We were kind of been in contact a good bit in the last 24 hours. I can't thank you enough for the short notice and coming on Gators Breakdown.
Oh, anytime, Dave. Thanks for having me on.
No, quickly, what you working on for the athletic, and what can guys guys and girls out there go out there and find?
Well, in the midst of trying to track down the what's going on with Chris Steele in that situation, aside from that, I'm working on some things involving Chris Bogle that I'm eager to kind of showcase sometime next week. I'll have some stuff on the scheduling as well, perhaps a look ahead into the future of what that could look like, why it's happening now, sort of what it means. So those are the two of the things aside from the Chris Steele, which is going to be an everyday thing as far as looking into what happened there.
All right, that's Will Salmon from The Athletic. Go and subscribe and check out some great content on the app there, website as well. But some really good content, some unique content there from The Athletic. So that's Will Salmon from The Athletic. Thanks for joining me. And host of Gators Breakdown, David Waters. Guys and girls, you can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. Thanks for listening to this episode of Gators Breakdown.